The heat settled over the house like a thick, silent fog, heavy and unmoving. Each morning began the same. His footsteps down the hall, the muted sound of the coffee machine, a brief morning without eye contact. He never stopped being kind. That was the problem. There was no clear fracture, nothing to point to and say, "This is why I feel so invisible." He still made me breakfast on Sundays, still asked how I slept, but never touched me. Not with intention, not with desire. I had become the wallpaper of our life. Present, familiar, but no longer noticed. I'd stopped wearing my usual cotton nightgown in the evenings, started choosing something thinner, softer, sometimes even sheer. It was ridiculous, I told myself that. But it gave me something. A sliver of control. A whisper of vanity. I'd put on perfume just to sit alone on the porch and water the flowers, just to feel the coolness of the bottle against my neck. I didn't do it for him. I wasn't even sure I did it for myself. It was more like a muscle memory, a ritual from a life I used to live. The plan was that he'd arrive next week. That was the agreement, or at least what my husband had told me. A short summer visit, a few weeks before the semester started. I hadn't given it much thought. He was still a boy in my mind, lanky and polite, quiet around adults. I was barefoot, in my robe, carrying the laundry basket out to the line when I heard the car. The crunch of gravel snapped through the heat. I didn't expect anyone. I squinted through the sun's glare, shielding my eyes with one hand, and then I saw him step out. He closed the car door without hurry, like someone who already belonged here. Taller, broader, his face angular now, sharper but his eyes unmistakable. And the way they landed on me, unflinching, calm, not the look of a child greeting an elder. It unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I felt exposed, truly exposed, for the first time in years. The silk robe clung to the side of my thigh where the breeze passed. His gaze didn't move, didn't slide away in embarrassment or out of respect. It held, it assessed, not with disrespect, but with certainty. He smiled as he approached, dropping his bag on the porch with a relaxed thud. "I'm early," he said, like he'd done it on purpose. I nodded, struggling to find a tone that wasn't too formal or too warm. Clearly. He looked around the yard as if inspecting an old memory. "Everything's smaller than I remember," he said. "Except the light. That's the same." And just like that, I remembered how quiet he could be, how comfortable he was in silence. He didn't rush to fill space. He waited, and I realized I had no idea how to stand. No idea what to say next. My heart wasn't racing. It was something slower, deeper, like the first shift of earth before a landslide. I invited him in, stepping aside as he passed. The air in the house changed when he entered. Warmer, heavier, not from the temperature, but from the presence of something unpredictable. My husband would be home in 2 hours. Until then, it was just the two of us, in a house too small for mystery. I watched him walk down the hallway with a kind of ease I hadn't seen in years, and for a moment I wished the robe had been even thinner. And still, I told myself, he was just a guest. Just family. This was nothing but a strange moment in the sun. But when he looked over his shoulder and smiled again, there was something in it that did not belong to the past. And I knew, whether I wanted it or not, that something had begun. The next morning began the same, but the air felt altered, as if the house itself had become aware of the shift. My husband left early for a supply run, muttering something about the heat wave and getting ahead of the crowd at the hardware store. I nodded from the kitchen table, still in my robe, fingers wrapped around a mug that had long since cooled. He appeared behind me without a sound, barefoot, shirt slightly creased from sleep. "I was going to make coffee," he said, reaching for the tin on the highest shelf. I stood without thinking, brushing past him to grab it. Our fingers met on the lid. The moment was small. It shouldn't have meant anything. But his hand didn't move. Mine didn't either. I looked up and he was already looking at me. Not with hesitation or confusion, but with that same composure, the kind that makes it hard to tell what he's thinking. Only this time I didn't want to know. I wanted to feel. "Let me," he said softly, his voice too close. I let go of the tin. He didn't step back. I could smell his skin, that faint mix of sweat and laundry soap and something else. Something young, electric, and dangerous. I turned toward the window, pretending to be occupied with the garden, though my heart was pressing fast against my ribs. I didn't expect the silence to fill the room so completely. The kettle clicked off behind us, but neither of us moved. "I always liked this kitchen," he said suddenly. "I always liked this kitchen," he said suddenly. "It feels like time slows down in here." "It does," I murmured. "Sometimes too much." There was no smile, no laugh, just the weight of the words lingering between us like the humidity outside. He stepped closer. I could feel the warmth of his chest near my shoulder. Not touching, just there. Like a question he wasn't asking, but already knew the answer to. Then, without warning, without ceremony, he kissed me. It wasn't hesitant or unsure. It was real, rooted in something he'd clearly considered already. It didn't ask permission, and I didn't give it. I didn't move away. His mouth on mine was soft, but anchored. A quiet claim. My body tensed, then softened. Not out of surrender, but from a strange, long-forgotten relief. When it ended, we didn't speak. He looked at me, waiting for something. Guilt, a slap, denial. But I had nothing to offer. Only breath. Only the sharp sting of awareness rushing back into my limbs. I turned away and busied myself with the cups. My hands trembled slightly as I poured. He leaned on the counter, watching me with unreadable calm. "Do you regret it already?" he asked. I shook my head without turning. "Number, but I should." "You always do what you should?" "No," I said. "That's the problem." We drank in silence, the coffee bitter and hot against my lips. My skin still tingled where he'd touched me. Nothing had changed, and yet the world outside that window felt farther away now, like we'd stepped behind a curtain that couldn't be pulled back. When my husband returned, we sat at the table like usual. He asked about the morning, and I said we'd made coffee. Nothing more. But I didn't look at either of them. I was too busy trying to memorize the way my lips still felt. Still swollen. Still claimed. And later that night, as I undressed alone in the bathroom, I reached for different lingerie. Something silk, black, with lace across the ribs. Not for my husband. Not for anyone who didn't see me. I slipped into it and studied my reflection for a long time. Not to judge. Just to remember who I was becoming. He found the excuse himself. My husband had mentioned the garden fence earlier that week. One of the corners sagging, the netting too loose for the climbing roses. It was the kind of thing he always intended to fix, but never quite did. When the topic came up again over dinner, the man now, offered to take care of it. "I'll go into town tomorrow," he said, his voice even. "We'll need new posts and that green netting from the garden center." My husband nodded, pleased. "Take her with you," he added. "She knows what type I want." I said nothing. Just watched the young man across the table, how calmly he sipped his water, how easily he kept his expression unreadable. The next morning, I put on jeans I hadn't worn in months and a cotton shirt that clung too close to the skin. I left the house with hair still damp from the shower, perfume subtle behind my ears. He was waiting by the car already, the passenger door open. The ride was quiet at first. The air conditioner coughed warm air before finally giving in to the July heat. I rolled the window down, letting wind whip strands of hair against my cheek. He glanced over a few times but said nothing until we were nearly out of the neighborhood. "You seem different," he said eventually. I looked at him. "Different how?" "Lighter, less careful." I didn't answer. I didn't know how. There were too many ways to interpret that, and none of them were safe. We arrived at the garden center just after 10, only to find it temporarily closed for inventory. The sign on the gate read, "Back at noon," and the parking lot was nearly empty. I reached for my phone automatically, but there was no signal. He shrugged. "There's a diner just down the road," he said. "We can wait there." I should have said no. Should have suggested we drive back, return later, take separate cars next time. But I didn't. I followed him down the gravel shoulder like a woman who had already said yes, long before she ever spoke. The diner was nearly empty, the hum of a ceiling fan masking the low chatter of two older men at the counter. We took a booth in the far corner, vinyl seats faded from sun and time. The waitress brought us coffee and menus we didn't open. "I used to wonder about you," he said suddenly, staring out the window. I blinked. "About me?" He nodded. "When I visited as a kid, you were always quiet, but I could tell you were thinking. I just never knew what about." I hesitated, fingers wrapped around my mug. "I didn't know you noticed me back then." "I noticed everything, especially what no one else did." I felt the words settle in my chest like weight. Not heavy, not painful, just undeniable. He wasn't making small talk. He wasn't fishing for praise or playing at nostalgia. He was telling me the truth. "What do you wonder now?" I asked, voice lower than I meant. He leaned in slightly, not touching, not close enough to cross a line, but near enough to make the booth feel smaller. "I wonder why you never leave this place. Why you stay still when you look like someone who's always wanted to move." "I'm not a girl anymore," I said. "People like me don't start over. We endure." "You're not old," he said. "You're just used to being unseen." His words sliced cleaner than I expected. No judgment, just clarity. I wanted to disagree, to say I was fine, that I chose this life. But part of me knew he was right. I had become someone whose days were shaped by other people's decisions, whose beauty had been carefully folded away like good linen, only brought out for special occasions that never came. "I can't just vanish," I said. "There are things that matter. People who would understand more than you think." He interrupted. Our food came, forgotten almost instantly. We picked at it without appetite. The heat outside had shifted into something storm-like, thick and waiting. I didn't know if I was trembling because of him or because I'd finally allowed someone to say out loud what I'd kept hidden for years. Back in the car, we didn't speak. The silence wasn't awkward. It was charged. His hand brushed mine once as we buckled in. It stayed between us for a second too long, fingers grazing the edge of my skin like a secret daring to be spoken. When we pulled into the driveway, the sky had begun to darken. We carried the fence posts around the side of the house, pretending nothing had happened. But later, when I stood alone in my bedroom, folding the shirt I'd worn, I noticed the faintest scent still clinging to it. Not perfume, not sweat. Him. And I realized I didn't want it to wash away. Not yet. The house was full by early afternoon. His sister had arrived with 2 shopping bags, a bouquet of flowers, and a voice that always seemed to echo louder than the room required. My husband looked genuinely pleased to see her, which made me try a little harder with the wine glasses, with my smile, with pretending I didn't feel like something inside me had turned liquid and unpredictable. He was gone. No explanation, just a note on the counter that he'd be out for a couple of days, scribbled next to an empty coffee cup. No mention of where, no time of return. I read the note 3 times before folding it carefully and sliding it into my apron pocket, as if it might mean something later. As if it were a clue. She stayed for lunch and half the evening, talking mostly to her brother about renovations, the cost of flights, the tomatoes in her garden. I played the part, laughing when expected, refilling glasses, nodding at the right moments. But my eyes kept moving to the hallway, to the sound of cars outside. I caught myself checking my phone 3 times for no reason at all. The silence he left behind was different from the one that usually filled the house. This one was unfinished. It pressed against my chest like a held breath. I wore a navy blue dress that day. Fitted, soft, one he hadn't seen before. It clung at the waist, dipped slightly at the back. Too formal for family, maybe. But I didn't care. I wasn't dressing for the sister. I wasn't even dressing for myself. I just wanted to feel his eyes on me again, even in his absence. That evening, after she finally drove off, my husband suggested we sit on the porch, wine in hand, the cicadas humming through the twilight. He leaned into his chair with a sigh, content. I watched his profile in the fading light, thinking how unchanged it was, how the years had settled on him without much resistance. "You've been quiet today," he said suddenly. "I guess I'm just tired." "Too much talking." He smiled. "She never stops." "She fills the room," I murmured. "She's good at that." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, but definite. I thought he might say more, but he didn't. He just sipped his wine and stared into the garden. I realized he was still a man who believed everything was fine as long as there was no conflict. As long as we smiled and shared a meal, the foundation held. Later, when I lay in bed beside him, his breathing evened out quickly. Sleep always came easily to him. I stared at the ceiling, the fan casting slow-moving shadows across the wall. I imagined where he had gone, what he was doing. Not with paranoia, but with something closer to longing. I walked barefoot to the guest room. It smelled faintly of him, even now, of cedar, soap, something warm. I stood there in the dark, arms crossed, the skin on my arms humming for no reason I could name. Then I heard the front door. Software. Controlled. I didn't move. Footsteps crossed the hallway. Paused. A door opened. Not mine. Not yet. But I knew, with a clarity that almost made my knees buckle, that he was home. And that I wasn't done wanting him. Not even close. The rain came just after noon, sudden and hard, drumming on the windows like it had been waiting for the perfect moment. My husband had gone into town for an appointment. I watched his taillights disappear down the wet driveway, then turned back to the kitchen where he stood, hair still damp from the shower, sleeves pushed to his elbows, watching the storm as if it had something to say to him. We were supposed to drive to the next town over. A hardware store there had the right type of mesh my husband wanted. He left the list on the fridge, circled in red marker, the way he always did when he wanted something done his way without saying it out loud. We didn't rush. We let the rain slow us down. I packed a sweater, just in case. He drove. Halfway there, traffic halted. An accident or maybe flooding. The radio said the road ahead was closed indefinitely. He looked over at me, one hand still on the wheel. "We could turn around." I didn't answer. He glanced out at the gray stretch of highway, then back to me. "Or we could wait it out somewhere." The motel sat just off the next exit. Aged brick, flickering vacancy sign, a lobby that smelled of damp carpet and burned coffee. He handed over his ID without hesitation. I stood beside him, arms crossed tightly, feeling the weight of every silent choice. There was only one room available. 2 beds, 1 window, a television bolted to the dresser. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't secretive. It was real. Too real. He dropped his bag on the chair and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to watch the rain hammer the pavement. "I used to love weather like this," he said, made the world feel paused. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers curled into the bedspread. "Paused," I echoed. "That's exactly how it feels." He turned to look at me then. Not like before. Not soft or tentative. There was something sharper now, something decided. "I don't want to just be someone who passes through," he said. "Not in your life." I felt my throat tighten. This wasn't supposed to happen. I know. But it did. He took a step closer, and I don't regret it. The silence between us vibrated. I stood without meaning to. My hands were cold, but my chest was burning. He reached out, touching my face. Not sudden, not even urgent. Just certain. The kiss was nothing like the first. It wasn't a question. It was an answer. It tasted of rain, of restraint broken open. He pulled me closer, slowly, like he'd been waiting to be allowed this, like he wasn't asking anymore. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to. Later, lying side by side on separate beds, fully dressed, we listened to the television hum in the background. Some travel show, meaningless narration filling the quiet. "I think about you all the time," he said, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I didn't look at him. I was afraid that if I did, I wouldn't be able to look away. "I don't want this to end," I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Then, "So don't let it." I turned off the TV and let the silence fall like a second blanket. We didn't touch again. Not that night. We didn't have to. My body still remembered everything. My skin still carried the weight of his hands. The storm eased by morning. We checked out without speaking to each other, the way strangers do. But in the car, when he started the engine, he looked at me and said, "You don't have to pretend when you're with me." And I realized I hadn't pretended in days. Not since the moment I saw him on that porch. Not since I wanted him to stay. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. It moved with us, lived between the walls of the house like an echo no one else could hear. We returned from the motel just after noon, the sun already high, puddles drying on the pavement. He carried the fencing supplies to the garage as if nothing unusual had happened. As if we hadn't crossed a line so deliberate, so final, that nothing we said could undo it. My husband was home, working in the backyard. He greeted us with a smile, wiped his hands on his jeans, then looked back at the row of plants he was staking. He asked about the trip in passing, and I answered too quickly, fumbling over a half-lie about road closures and a late delivery. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and simply chose not to ask. That evening, something in him shifted. He invited me to sit with him on the porch, poured 2 glasses of wine, and talked. Not about errands or his schedule, but about us. He asked how I was sleeping, if I felt lonely, if I ever missed the way things used to be. I answered carefully, trying to find the safest words. I said I was fine, that I appreciated the stability, that I was just tired lately, nothing more. He reached for my hand across the table. It surprised me. His palm was rougher than I remembered. Warm, familiar, but also distant in a way that made my chest ache. His touch used to set my skin alight. Now it felt like the gesture of someone trying to remember what closeness once meant. That night, he came to bed earlier than usual. He lay beside me in the dark, one hand on my waist, breath steady against the back of my neck. I froze. Not because I didn't want it, but because I didn't know if I could give myself to him honestly. I tried. I turned to him, let him kiss me, let his hands move over me the way they had years ago. But my body didn't respond. I felt myself floating somewhere outside of it, aware of every moment but detached from all sensation. I waited for something to awaken in me, something warm or instinctive or simply human. But there was only silence. Not on the outside, but inside my chest. A quiet absence where desire used to live. Afterward, he kissed my shoulder and whispered that he loved me. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't love him, but because I didn't know how to say it without lying. I went to the bathroom, turned the shower on cold, and stood under it long enough for my fingertips to wrinkle. The water bit into my skin like a question I couldn't answer. I wrapped a towel around myself and stared into the mirror, searching for a version of me I still recognized. When I returned to the bedroom, he was asleep, one arm draped across my pillow. I slid under the covers quietly, careful not to wake him, and lay on my back, staring into the dark. I thought about the night before. The way he had whispered, "You don't have to pretend with me." How easily those words had rooted themselves inside me. And I wondered, not for the first time, if the version of me that came alive in his presence could ever return to this life, to this bed, to a man who touched my body, but no longer reached my soul. Sleep didn't come easily that night. It hadn't in weeks. But my longing was no longer vague or shapeless. It had a name, a voice, a scent that clung to my skin long after I washed it away, and a room across the hall that still held the ghost of his breath. The idea for the dinner came from my husband. He said it casually while flipping through the mail, as if it were just another evening plan, nothing more. We should all eat together tomorrow. Something nice. I'll cook. His voice was light, content. He even suggested grilling, though he rarely did anymore. I agreed too quickly. I didn't ask questions. I didn't look across the kitchen where he stood, where the air already felt a degree heavier. He prepared the meal with a quiet pride I hadn't seen in months. He trimmed the meat with precision, picked rosemary from the garden, opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving for something. I watched him move, and for a brief moment I saw the man I married. Capable, calm, focused. But it was like watching someone play a part they hadn't rehearsed in years. He arrived just before 7. I was already dressed. Simple, but sharp. A dark green dress with a low back and bare shoulders. Nothing overt. Just enough to feel like the air might catch on my skin as I walked. Enough to feel wanted, even if only by my own reflection. When he entered, his eyes met mine instantly. There was no pause, no lingering look, but something unspoken passed between us in the quiet of that greeting. My husband poured drinks, made small talk. He brought out the food like it was a celebration. "Feels like old times," he said, lifting his glass. We clinked, smiled, chewed, but beneath the table my knees trembled. Every movement felt too rehearsed, every silence too pregnant. I was aware of every inch between our chairs, of the way his leg shifted just slightly toward mine when he leaned in to grab the salt. The conversation drifted. My husband reminisced about childhood vacations, told stories about the lake house, fishing lines, muddy shoes. The boy nodded politely, offered short comments, but said little. His attention was divided. Careful. "You've gotten quiet." My husband joked at one point, directing the remark at me. "Just listening," I said, taking a sip of wine I didn't taste. After dinner, he stepped out to make a phone call. Something about the office, a change in scheduling. I began to clear plates, stacking them too neatly, pretending the rhythm of dish and glass would calm me. He followed me into the kitchen without a word. For a moment, we stood in silence, the weight of the house pressing in around us. He reached for a plate. Our hands brushed. I didn't pull away. "I don't know how much longer I can act like I don't want you," he whispered, barely audible. I turned to face him. "Then don't." He exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath for days. Footsteps returned from the porch. My husband's voice, light, normal. We stepped apart in one seamless motion as though nothing had happened. But something had. Later, after everything was clean and quiet, I sat alone on the edge of my bed, staring at the moonlight on the floor. I could still feel his fingers against mine. Still hear the tremor in his voice. Still taste the moment we almost didn't resist. I thought about how close we were to being discovered, and how I hadn't cared. Not really. Because what terrified me more than being found out was the idea of never feeling his skin again. Never hearing that voice say my name with meaning. The real betrayal wasn't in what we did. It was in what I wanted next. It was just a piece of paper, torn from the edge of an old notepad, the corners slightly curled. I never meant for him to read it. It wasn't even meant to be saved. But something in me needed to write it. Needed to see the words outside of myself, where they could exist without shame or explanation. I wrote it late one night, alone in the kitchen, the clock ticking loudly in the quiet. The letter wasn't long. It wasn't poetic. It was honest, blunt, a confession in plain language. Not about what had happened, but what I felt. The way my body had come alive again. The way his presence had fractured a stillness I hadn't even realized had settled in my bones. I wrote that I didn't know what I wanted. only that I hadn't felt like a woman in years until he looked at me like one. I folded the page carefully and slid it between the pages of a book on my nightstand, a novel I hadn't touched in months. I didn't plan to give it to him. I wasn't that reckless. But maybe some part of me wanted it found. And it was. I noticed it missing 2 days later. The book had been moved, the letter gone. There was no confrontation, no awkward moment, just a slip of paper under my pillow that evening. His handwriting, neat, deliberate. I feel it too. I'm not confused. I'm not sorry. And I'm not going anywhere unless you ask me to. I lay on the bed with that note on my chest, the weight of it heavier than anything I'd worn in years. I read it 3 times before slipping it into the pocket of my coat. I couldn't throw it away. I couldn't risk keeping it in the open, but I had to carry it. That afternoon, I made tea. I moved through the house like normal, folded laundry, watered plants. But every movement had new gravity. Every touch of fabric, every brush of leaves felt heightened. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and saw someone I didn't fully recognize. A woman who was hiding. Yes, but also glowing. Quietly, from somewhere deep beneath the skin. He found me in the garden just before sunset. My husband had gone into town again. Another errand. Another hour of absence that neither of us named for what it was. He didn't say anything. Just walked to where I was kneeling, gloves covered in damp earth. I stood, brushing dirt from my hands, trying to keep from reaching for him. "You left me an answer," I said. He nodded. I meant every word. I watched him for a long moment. The breeze lifted the hair at his temple. He looked tired, alive, hungry in the way I felt inside myself. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted. He stepped closer. "Then don't try to figure it out all at once." We didn't touch. Not then. Not yet. The air between us held enough tension to crack the sky. I went back inside and opened my drawer, pulling out a piece of lingerie I hadn't worn in years. Soft ivory lace, the kind that barely held shape, more suggestion than substance. I didn't put it on for anyone that night. I didn't light candles or look in the mirror. I just held it in my hands. And I knew I was already further gone than I'd ever planned to be, because wanting him no longer felt like a choice. It felt like the only truth I had left. The station was smaller than I remembered. Just 2 tracks, a cracked bench, and a vending machine with flickering buttons. The kind of place where people didn't linger, where departures were meant to be quick and forgettable. But I stood there longer than I should have, my coat clutched tightly at the collar, the wind tugging at the hem of my dress like it wanted to carry me off somewhere else. He had told me 2 days ago that he was leaving, just for a while. A short trip before the new semester started. Nothing dramatic, nothing final. He said it like it didn't mean anything, but I heard it in his voice. Hesitation, restraint, the quiet hope that I'd ask him to stay. I didn't. I didn't say anything at all. I nodded and turned away, then spent the night in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to pretend I still knew who I was. But when the morning came, I dressed without thinking. Not for my husband. Not for the day. For him. A soft blouse tucked into a skirt that moved when I walked, low heels that clicked on the driveway as I stepped outside. I told my husband I was going to the market. I didn't even wait to hear his response. He was already at the platform when I arrived, one hand on the strap of his bag, the other in his pocket. He didn't pace. He stood still like he knew I would come, like he had been sure all along. Our eyes met, and I felt my breath catch. Not from nerves, not even from sadness, but from the sheer relief of seeing him one more time without pretense. "I didn't think you'd come," he said quietly. I told myself I wouldn't. He smiled, the kind that hurt. "But here you are." I nodded. "Here I am." We didn't touch. We didn't dare. There were people nearby. An older couple, a teenager with headphones, a man tapping at his phone. But it wasn't the crowd that held us back. It was something deeper. We had already said more with our silences than words ever could. "I'm coming back," he said. "I know. Will you be here?" "I don't know who I'll be when you return." He looked at me then, not with sadness or hope, but with something softer, understanding, maybe even peace. "Whatever changes, don't forget this," he said, pulling a small folded note from his coat pocket and pressing it into my hand. "Don't forget what it felt like to be seen." The train approached, a low hum swelling into thunder. He stepped back, nodded once, and boarded without another word. I didn't open the note right away. I waited until I was back in my car, fingers trembling, heart too full. Inside was just a line. "You made me brave." I hope I did the same. I sat there until the platform emptied, until the clouds thickened and the sky threatened rain. Then I drove home. Slowly, deliberately, knowing that nothing looked different, but everything was. My husband greeted me at the door with a distracted smile, asked about the market. I said it was crowded. I kissed his cheek. I hung my coat. That night, I stood in the mirror wearing nothing but the ivory lace I had once only held. I didn't think about right or wrong. I didn't think about guilt. I thought about hunger, about breath, about what it means to be alive and claimed and cracked open. And though he was gone, I knew I would never return to the woman I was before him. Because once you've been truly seen, you can't go back to being invisible. Not even for love.